So this is the loom. I have the loom on some silly putty stuck to the table so that it doesn't move around too much. So when you first set down the loom, you want to have the grooves at the top and at the bottom. First thing we're going to do is attach the string. We're going to tie the string in a knot around one of these sides. Now that you've got your string tied to the side of the loom, we're going to bring the string back. When you warp, you're going to bring the string from the top down through the first groove, down to the corresponding first groove on the bottom. You're then going to wrap the string around the groove, bring it up from the second groove to the corresponding second groove up on the top. This is called warping the loom. Now when you get to the end of warping the loom, you'll want to tie this string here. You'll bring it under and tie it right here to this piece of wood. Now we are going to weave. We are going to run yarn from left to right. We're going to weave through these warp threads. First, I'm going to take this darning needle and yarn, and I'm going to thread the needle. We're going to do the simplest form of weaving, which is over, under, over, under. So on this first string, the thread, so the darning needle will go on top of the first warp thread, it'll go under the second, on top of the third, under the fourth. So you can see, I'll pull through, how the yarn is going over, under each of these warp threads. So I'm going to continue this all the way through. This is the first row. So this yarn is what I'm going to use to weave back and forth. I'm going to pull through and leave a small tail at the very beginning, which is right here on the left side. So it's important to leave this bit at the beginning where you started. At the end, you'll be able to weave this in. To get this thread, this yarn, taut against the frame or the loom, you can use a fork. So now I'm going to weave from right to left, again over under, but I'm going to alternate. So here, the green yarn is on top of the orange warp thread. So I want to take the green yarn underneath now. Here on this row, the green yarn is underneath the warp thread, so now I want to be on top of the warp thread. And I'm going to pull through. One thing to pay attention to when you're pulling the yarn this way is this thread, that you don't pull the yarn so tight that it pulls this warp thread this way. We want to make sure that this stays loose enough. And again, we can take a fork and push the two green strands of yarn together. Now we're going to start the third row. It's going to be from left to right. On this last row, I ended with a green yarn underneath the orange warp thread. So now I want the green yarn to be on top of the orange warp thread. And I'm going to pull the yarn through. And I'm going to pay attention towards the tension here on the orange warp string, orange warp yarn. So now I'm going to continue weaving back and forth until I run out of this yarn. So I've used up all of the yarn. When I've run out of yarn, there's two things that I can do. One is I can tie this very end of the yarn to the beginning of the next yarn. You can tie it in a knot. And then continue weaving back and forth. You will have that knot in your weaving. So if you'd prefer, you can have the two strands overlap. So you'll begin your weaving. All right, I'm gonna let this lay over here. Now for the second strand of yarn, I will have it overlap. The end of the first yarn will overlap with the beginning of the second yarn for several warp strands. So we'll start here. So I'm going to weave in the exact same pattern as this strand of yarn. So and I'm going to finish the row. And I'm going to leave a tail about that long on both ends. As you weave back and forth and tighten up the weaving with the fork, what you can eventually do is take these two strands and you can simply cut them here and here because the tension of the weaving will hold it in place. Or if you wanted to thread this through a needle and maybe weave it through a little bit of your weaving on both ends. You can continue weaving back and forth all the way till you get to the very top always pushing down the weaving with a fork to keep it taut. And at the very end, if you were to end by weaving from right to left, you'd want to leave a bit of a tail, similar to how you've done here. And what you'll do is you'll thread the tail here and up here with a darning needle, and through the back side, you'll weave it through a couple of stitches to help hold the yarn in place, and then cut off the extra bit, as I did with the 2 strands of yarn that you saw earlier. You can use all different types of yarn. I have used the green wool yarn here. Here I used the roving that was included in your handwork kit. Here is roving, which what I did was I just took bits of roving about that long, went down, wrapped it around one warp thread and pulled it up, tied it in a knot, and then trimmed it so it was nice and short. You can also put in branches, sticks, bits of plant matter, be as creative as you want. And again, you'll be warping, you'll be weaving back and forth up until you get to the top. When you get to the bottom, you can either keep your weaving on the frame, or you can remove it simply by sliding the embroidery thread off of these grooves right here. You will need to push some of the woven material here down towards the end to help even out the tension. So you'll just simply be taking these loops and pulling them up, and on this side as well, and you'll have your piece of woven material.